Well, hello and welcome to my channel, The Withered Fig Tree. My name is Randy Silva, and I've been doing live streams about the importance of the Holy Spirit in the lives of Christians. And my current series is called The Seven Spirits of Revelation, and this is part 10. So let's go ahead and get started. So last week I started with going into a bit more detail on Revelation chapter 9, verses 13 through 16. That is about the four angels who were held back at the river Euphrates. So I gave some more detail about how those angels could be from the Garden of Eden and also from the time of Abraham. And then I gave some more detail on the little scroll, which is Revelation chapter 10. And that was sort of the review or extra credit. I then started with the main material, which was covering the enigmatic two witnesses and then the seventh trumpet. Now, the preterist view of the two witnesses is that they were two real people who lived in the city of Jerusalem during the siege and spoke and prophesied warnings to them about why they were being judged. I explained how the number two doesn't necessarily mean that there were two of something, but that it is a symbolic number representing partnership and strength. Nevertheless, though, my interpretation of the two witnesses are that they represent or they symbolize the early Christian church from 30 to 70 AD or before 70 AD. The early Christian church was centered in Jerusalem, and God had put a lot of power and authority in Jerusalem. There were the 11 original apostles, as well as Matthias, who was elected after Judas killed himself. And so there was 12 apostles in Jerusalem and Judea. And then there was one apostle, Paul, who was sent to the Gentiles. And not only the Gentiles, but the Jews in the diaspora. So in that case, you could look at the two wings of the two fronts, that's a better word. You could look at the two fronts of the new Christian church as the 12 apostles, or even just Peter as the front that is in Judea, and then the second witness would be the front of Paul, the apostle Paul, in Asia Minor and through all the way to his influence spread all the way to Spain, ultimately. So the idea was that the second witness was to reach all of the Jews in the diaspora. So either way that you look at it, this represents the time from 30 to late 60 AD. And then the seventh trumpet marks the end of the Old Covenant. Now, there's not any sort of plagues or disasters that are talked about in the seventh trumpet. So it's possible that the end of the sixth trumpet marked the actual physical destruction of the temple, or it might just be implied in the seventh trumpet. But nevertheless, the seventh trumpet's main purpose is to show the end of the Old Covenant. I would say either way, whether it's in the end of the sixth trumpet or the seventh trumpet, that what's important is that Christ's new kingdom, the new church that he started at his resurrection, is now uncontested. There's no longer an overlap between the old and new covenants. And now it is the sole mechanism of salvation or sole mechanism of relationship with God. Now, verse 18 in that chapter 11, at a surface level, it says, or the phrase that I'm keying in on is destroying those who destroy the land. So who is that talking about? And I talked about how it naturally points to Rome as the destroyer. So the land represents the promised land, Israel. You could think of it as Rome is the one who is doing the destroying, and those who are being destroyed are the Jews who did not convert to Christianity and missed the birth of the Messiah. This is talking about those who corrupted the land spiritually and then triggered judgment and then the judgment thereof. Now, I intentionally didn't cover verse 19, so because I wanted to spend some more time that I had on that remained. So I'll start with that today. I didn't actually say it, but the title of part 10 is The Woman, the Dragon, and the Two Beasts, although we'll only have time, I believe, today to cover one of those beasts, the beast out of the sea. All right, so starting with Revelation chapter 11, verse 19, ending the seventh trumpet. I titled the slide, The End of the Messianic Nation Covenant. Now, typically, this is referred to as the Old Covenant. I refer to it very often as the Old Covenant, but that is clearly from the Christian perspective. We call it the New Covenant because, well, we call it the Old Covenant because there's a New Covenant. Now, if you wanted to call it something else, you could call it the Mosaic Covenant or the Law Covenant or the Law-Based Covenant. You can't call it the Abrahamic Covenant because that is about the promise, and that is really more about the New Covenant, really. So you can't call it the Abrahamic Covenant, but you could call it the Mosaic Covenant or the Law Covenant. That would be accurate, but it's just descriptive. It's just saying what it is or who gave it. It doesn't say anything about what it's for. So I came up with this terminology or this idea that you could call it the Messianic Nation Covenant. That is both descriptive and functional, and it talks about how the purpose of the Old Covenant was to create a set of laws and a government such that a nation would be formed, and that the purpose of that nation would be to be a incubator and fertile grounds so that God could send the Messiah. Now, would modern Jews agree with this? No. Would Jews of that time agree with it? Maybe. They probably would have seen several important things, but when you look at Matthew, actually, if you look at the beginning of all of the Gospels, before Jesus is born, you can see them talking about the Messiah coming, and then after Jesus is born, you can see them continuing to ask, when is the Messiah going to come, or are you the Messiah, and when is the kingdom going to start? So the people of that time were definitely very focused on the Messiah. But the modern Jews would not agree with this. I would say this is a little bit of my own opinion, but I would say they've kind of given up on the idea of a Messiah. They've definitely given up on the idea of a strong, godly, messianic figure. And so you can't really blame them. It's been 2,000 years. And so if this Messiah was so important, why hasn't he come? Well, the Christians, myself, would say he has come. He came. And you missed it. In fact, he couldn't even come now, given the prophecies that are in the Old Covenant. So they wouldn't agree with that. But there are many scriptures which are clearly about the Messiah, clearly about Israel being the location that the Messiah would come from, and many scriptures or prophecies about how he would be God, or that he would be anointed. So I won't go through all of these, but here are a bunch of verses about how the Messiah would be a Davidic king and a royal Messiah. Some of these are, I guess you'd say, good Christmas verses about a child is born who will rule on David's throne, a shoot from the stump of Jesse, a righteous branch, a shepherd, servant from David. And then there are a lot of, so these are very direct. Then there are a lot of verses that talk about where he will come from. And so these are also good Christmas verses. You have Micah, that he will come from Bethlehem, and that a servant will arise from Israel, and Zion's good news of God's reign would go out to the nations. I didn't put it in there, but Isaiah chapter 2, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established, and it will stream out from Jerusalem. I suppose that's because it's a kingdom verse, but really you could look at any of the kingdom verses and associate them with the Messiah. So here are a lot of verses about how Israel, Bethlehem, will be the birthplace of the ruler. And then Daniel 9, well, first of all of Daniel's prophecies, well, not all of them, but the ones that are about the kingdom and the beast, point to this fourth kingdom where the Messiah would come. And then in Daniel 9, very specifically, he says the anointed one will appear and be cut off. And then it talks about the destruction of the Jewish temple. Look at a couple other verses about the temple climax and the arrival of the Messiah theme. You have Malachi 3. And you have Zechariah 16. There's many others that I could bring or talk about. The idea, though, is that it's very well established in this old covenant, this messianic nation covenant, that the prophecies therein and the laws themselves are all there to bring about the birth of the Messiah. That's important because Revelation 11:19, it says, "Then God's temple in heaven was opened, and within his temple was seen the ark of his covenant. And there came flashes of lightning, rumbles, peals of thunder, and an earthquake and a severe hailstorm." Now, there's a lot of symbolism there. Whenever God, one of the God heads, whether it's the Lamb or the seven spirits, or God the Father on the throne, whenever he shows up in this vision, there is lightning, thunder, earthquakes, and hailstorms. Just talk about power and just the rumbling of his voice and authority. But before that, it talks about how God's temple in heaven. So we know in Hebrews, it talks about how the earthly temple was a shadow of the temple in heaven. So there is a temple in heaven, and that's why God gave such strict description and measurements of how the temple should be created in, again, this law that is the old covenant that I'm calling the Messianic nation covenant. Here you can see it's talking about the temple of heaven, but now it's being opened. So in this, at the end of the seventh trumpet, this temple is being opened, and now you can see the Ark of the Covenant. I found a lot of interesting things about the Ark of the Covenant. Now, you have to ask yourself, why does verse 19, why does it end with God's temple and the Ark of the Covenant in heaven? What I found was that the Ark had disappeared long ago, relative to Jesus, relative to the first century. I knew that the Ark had disappeared, but I didn't know that. I guess it was well known that that was the case. So the last biblical references to the Ark are 2 Chronicles 35:3. That's when Josiah says in around 622 BC, "Put the holy Ark in the house," which, it's not, this is an exact quote, but then further on it says, "which Solomon built." So this is the first Solomon temple. Put it in there. The last Old Testament prophetic reference to the Ark is Jeremiah 3:16, which was around 615 plus or minus 3 or so years BC. The Ark will not come to mind, nor will another one be made. So this was a prophecy, and in some ways you could say it's a self-fulfilled prophecy, because the Jews, of course, received this prophecy, wrote it down, and it became part of the Old Testament. And so when they see the Ark go away, you might think, well, just build another one. There's nothing in the law that says you can't and that gives the prescription as to how to build it, so let's just build another one. But the prophecy says that you're not even going to think about it, and then you're not going to make another one. So they'd go, okay, we won't then. Once it goes away, we won't make another one. Now, if you note, this is well before the Babylonian destruction of the first temple in 586, around 40 years before the destruction of of Solomon's temple by Babylon. And Scripture never records the destruction of the ark, it being captured or ever being returned. And the Babylonians themselves do not list it in the items they take, whereas they had meticulously mentioned, and this is outside of the Bible, in their own annals, they write all the different things that they take from, kind of pridefully, they list the things that they take from the nations they defeat. And then, unlike other types of lost artifacts like the menorah, for instance, there's no biblical texts that promise its restoration in the Second Temple era, nor is there a list of it. It's not listed in Cyrus when Cyrus returns all of the things that had been taken by Babylon. So where did the ark go? I don't know. Maybe it's on Oak Island. I watched the Curse of Oak Island, and that's one of the theories. Maybe it's hidden beneath the temple somewhere. There's all kinds of catacombs and things, or maybe it was rushed out of the temple and buried in some cave. Now, I had thought that it disappeared, but then, even though it's not mentioned directly about it coming back when the second temple was built, I thought that maybe the assumption was the ark was put back, even though it's not mentioned specifically or explicitly. It came back, and now it's in the second temple. But that's not the case. The Jews knew, not just the high priest or the priest, but the Jews themselves knew that the ark never made its way into the second temple. And so you can see this in Mishnah Yoma 5:2. Yoma is all about Yom Kippur. It says, after the ark had been taken away, there was a stone from the days of earlier prophets called the Shetiah. The Holy of Holies, therefore, it didn't contain the ark, but a foundational stone. So the idea is that there was a stone that the ark would rest on that was from old times, maybe even back from the tent temple, but that after the ark was gone, they still had the stone, so that wasn't lost. And so they put the stone in the second temple, in the most holy of holies, and that is what sort of represented the ark. Now, my question and my thought was, shouldn't there have been a theological shock to the Jews that the ark is gone? I mean, they talk about the walls in Nehemiah, the walls of Jerusalem have been burned down, and it was this terrible insult to God. Shouldn't there have been a theological shock that the Ark of the Covenant was missing and never rebuilt or never found again? And it doesn't seem like there was. And I put some points here that the ark symbolized God's throne on earth, the mercy seat, covenant testimony, atonement. Oh, there we go. Yeah, atonement via the mercy seat. And now with the ark gone, the Yom Kippur let me say that again. The Yom Kippur law could not be followed. So, for instance, Leviticus 16:14 says, "He shall take some of the blood of the bull and sprinkle it with his finger on the front of the mercy seat and on the east side, and in front of the mercy seat he shall sprinkle some blood with his finger 7 times." So that law cannot be followed. In fact, in Mishnah Yoma 5, continuing, it talks about how he did it on the stone. So he would just take some blood, and they kind of were treating, in a way, the stone. They knew it didn't have a mercy seat, but at least it was sort of a representative of the ark. So they would sprinkle blood on this stone that they called the Shetiah. And that is how they sort of followed the law. And maybe that's why there wasn't a theological shock. I'm not sure, but this really, you can either say it sets the tone or it sets precedence. It at least indicates how the Jews thought about these things, that operating without the ark sets precedence about how Judaism can persist without major components. Before this, I was always amazed at how Judaism could exist beyond 70 AD after the destruction of the temple. But because to me, it's like the temple, there's so much of the law that requires a temple, and so now the law cannot be followed. Well, the law couldn't be followed without the ark either. And so they sort of made the temple missing is much bigger than just the ark missing. But what you can see in the what's the word? I don't want to say philosophy, but in the heart or the mindset, that's a better word. In the mindset of the Jews, when God judged them and exiled them, for instance, or caused the ark to disappear or be taken and never returned, or caused the temple to be destroyed by the Romans, then they would operate within that judgment. And if God ever created the circumstances where that could be rectified, for instance, when the second temple was built, it was very obvious that God was behind it, because Cyrus not only returned the items, but he also gave a lot of resources and protection and all types of things for the Jews to rebuild this temple and the walls of Jerusalem and so forth. And so that they saw was a very clear sign from God. And I guess you would say that nowadays, if there was some sort of clear sign from God, not that they manually take the mount where the temple is, but somehow, I guess, if God's somehow just miraculously made it obvious that the temple mount was now, excuse me, was now clear, and now a third temple could be built, or maybe the third temple just starts being built by God or somebody. I don't know. If God were to make it obvious, then they would go with that. They'd say, okay, God is returning the temple to us. But that they wouldn't go out of their way to rebuild the temple themselves and really take matters in their own hands. They would live in the judgment and condemnation that they had deserved, or their forefathers had deserved, until such a time that God restores it. Is that the right way to think? I can see why that's why they think that way, but excuse me, from a Christian standpoint, it still doesn't make sense to me. I guess I understand it, but it doesn't make sense to me. That to me, these seem like omens. They seem like signs that the Jews should have taken and said, something's wrong. We need to start figuring out what happened, and hopefully then they would see that the Messiah came and they would all become Christians. But clearly that's not the case. Okay, so let's talk about the woman and the dragon. That's Romans. That's Revelation chapter 12. I don't have time really to read this whole chapter, but definitely read it on your own. Remember, reading this was supposed to bring blessings. But this talks about a great sign appearing in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and with 12 stars on her head. These are all very strong symbols. Hopefully things like Joseph's dream might come to mind. And these are all some symbols of how Jerusalem and Israel were God's chosen nation, or chosen nation is not even right. He created the nation and they were his chosen people. She was pregnant and cried out in pain. You could see from a symbolic standpoint that Israel was pregnant with the Messiah before the Messiah is born. And so the Messiah, is born in, let's say, 3 or 4 BC. Before that, it's not that this is all symbolic. It's a metaphor. And so it's not like they wouldn't start talking about the Messiah until 9 months before he was born or something like that. These 9 months of gestation of the Messiah really are the history of Israel, especially after they enter the Promised Land. Okay, so that's the woman is Israel, and I should say that the preterist view. These are all very established in the preterist view. I'm not sure if I make any sort of novel statements or statements that aren't common to the preterist view, I'll say this. But Revelation 12 and 13, from the preterist view standpoint, is pretty well determined, and I would agree with that these symbols, going in line with our methodology from the first and second parts of this series, that we would take these symbols and plug them into where they appear in the scriptures and see what we come up with. Well, when you do that, it's a pretty clear story. So the woman is Israel. The child, of course, is the Messiah. So it says in verse 5, she gave birth to a son, a male child, who will, quote, rule all the nations with an iron scepter. And so that is a reference to Psalm 2:9. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. So that's, it's a lot of details missing. There's no ascension, or he was going to give a message or anything like that. That's not what this part of the vision is for. So here we just know that it's not retelling the gospel or explaining this redemptive conflict, but that's all you need to know, is that the child is born. He is the Messiah. The women fled to the wilderness, prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. Remember, that's number 3.5 years, and that is a time of turmoil or persecution. And that is where the woman, or Israel, it says that she fled, but she really didn't go anywhere. She stayed in Israel. So these are symbolic metaphors. So then it doesn't talk about the dragon quite yet, but it talks about this war that breaks out in heaven. Oh yeah, this is where it says. So then a war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough. They lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil, or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. So there's no mystery here. The dragon is definitely Satan, and we'll see that it's Satan specifically operating around or behind these earthly powers, like the Empire of Rome. Now, I looked into this idea of using the dragon. It's Drakon, or Drakon in Greek, and it's a very deliberate and important choice. So he doesn't use the word beast. He uses that word in other places, but beast in apocalyptic language refers to political systems, rulers, nations, empires. So that is not what the dragon is. The dragon is Satan. So the dragon refers symbolically, it's a rarer symbol in apocalyptic language, but it is nonetheless a symbol that is not found anywhere else in the New Testament. I don't believe it's in the Old Testament either, other than the word serpent. But it is found in other apocalyptic language to refer to Satan as something that predates humanity, that it's a cosmic symbol, that it has to do with the Edenic or pre-Edenic times. It's not just about Rome or something like that. This is Satan and Satan's, you can think of like the scroll, for instance, as God's plan. So you can think of the dragon as the sort of like the lamb in this other dark side of the story. That creates his own plan and tries to do things to disrupt God's plan. Okay, so we talked about this primordial signal, and tells the reader the conflict is not merely first century politics, but the culmination of a long-running spiritual war. So that is very important, that this is not just symbolic, but it goes all the way back to this war in heaven. Not that the war in heaven against Michael broke out in the first century, but it's going all the way back to that time to say that this is why all of this had to happen. Why the fall of humanity occurred, why, or at least in part, why the fall of humanity occurred, and why there had to be this scroll, this redemptive plan of God to bring about the Messiah and salvation and a restoration of the spirit within God, within man, to be able to repair or restore the relationship that God had with humans, like he had in Adam and Eve before the fall. So I put here that the vision is rewinding. Remember in chapter 11 at the very end, which we just started with in verse 19, that is 80-70. So now we're going all the way back really to the beginning of time, or before humanity in some places. But Revelation 12 does that. It steps back way before the seals and the trumpets. Remember, I believe the seals had to do with the history of Israel as a nation, and then the trumpets had to do with this time from the Messiah, the resurrection of the Messiah, to the destruction of the temple. To explain the theological cause of all this, the cause of all this goes all the way back to Satan's rebellion against God, when he was called Lucifer and he fought against God, and a third of the angels were cast down to the earth. So initially he did try to work through people. Remember, Herod killed all of the children 3 years and under, and Joseph and Mary and Jesus had to flee to Egypt. And then, of course, Satan tried to seduce Jesus into becoming a pawn in his own story through power and wealth and fame. And Jesus, of course, did not take that bait. And then he worked through the Jews to have him murdered on the cross. And perhaps he thought he was he was victorious in that. I'm not sure. I don't know the spiritual realities of these things, but he was definitely trying to thwart God's plan. And of course, he just falls into God's plan and plays along with what God was already imagining, or not imagining, but planning is the better word. So even after Jesus, Israel remains a central part of the story, because it's not just a loose end, but something has to happen to Israel. Something has to happen to this nation as its purpose is now fulfilled. The old covenant is fulfilled in the Messiah and the death and resurrection of the Messiah. Now, I put here that this rewind in the vision strengthens this idea that I had, this covenant view, that the seals are about Israel's covenant history and not about the church or the modern world as other views would have it, because it shows that Revelation is prepared to and actually does reach back in time, even past the Jews coming out of Egypt, all the way back to Edenic times, and even pre-Edenic times, when prehistory, when Lucifer rebelled against God. So here in this verse, this is second half of verse 10. Now have come the salvation and power, and let's see, let me start over. Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. So, and it keeps on going. This is like this is a loud voice in heaven saying this. So that's, I guess one of the archangels, or probably just God saying this. But what's important is I don't believe that God is announcing the start of the gospel here in 70 AD. What he is announcing is its uncontested continuance. So the old covenant and the new covenant coexisted for 40 years, from 30 to 70 AD. You could make the argument that the old covenant ended right at the resurrection of Jesus, and all Jews had to switch over to the new covenant right away, or they would go to hell. But it seems as though we don't have all of the details that God has given us, but it seems as though that's not the case, that the old covenant and the new covenant coexisted. God gave them these 40 years, the same time as they're wandering in the desert, to repent of their missing and killing of his Messiah. Then we have chapter 13. We'll just do this first part, the beast out of the sea. That is verses 1 through 10, this beast out of the sea is not Satan. We already know that Satan is the dragon. You can see it says in verse 1, the dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on each of the horns, and on each head had a blasphemous name. So the dragon is sort of delivering or standing there and watching as this beast comes out of the sea. The sea is a general symbol for humanity or a place of creation. And so here comes out of the sea this beast, which is Rome, the Roman Empire. And you can see immediately that this frames the beast as a foreign imperial force pressing on Israel. I'm looking for a good verse that talks about that. But again, if you read this verses 1 through 10, it's actually this is probably the clearest. 12 and 13 are some of the clearest parts of Revelation, at least from the preterist view, and then also this covenant view. So sea language is the Gentile world, and the beast arises from these nations that are outside of Israel, and then they make their way to Israel and take over Israel. Then the beast, I put the beast as Rome as a system, not just a single emperor. So there's this idea that these symbols that are given, sometimes the symbols mean things, they definitely mean things, but then sometimes they're also literal. And so here it talks about 10 horns, 7 heads, and each of the head having, actually it had 10 horns and 7 heads, maybe even 7 heads on each horn, depending on how you read it. And then there's 10 crowns on the horns. And so this is a ugly looking beast, to say the least. But remember, this is not just trying to draw the picture of a beast. These are all symbols, 7 being the divine completion number, 10 being the human completion number, and crown being something of authority, and the horn being a power or an actual king or an emperor. So were there actually 10 emperors? Well, most people definitely would say Julius was not an emperor because he was the last part of the Republic of Rome, but Augustus was the first true emperor. And then you can see this list. Now, as of this exact moment, which if we're right at the destruction of the temple, we're still at Vespasian, and Titus was just, I wouldn't say was just, but it was his son, and he was a general, and he would become an emperor. And so, theoretically, are there just 9? What about this Titus? Can we count him? Well, I think we can count him. He's a general, and he's going to be one of the Caesars. But even if it's not, even if you're just stuck with 9 and you don't know how to get the 10th one, this whole idea is that these numbers are symbolic. So the beast here, you'll see as you read it, the beast was given, this is verse 5, the beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise its authority for 42 months. Again, there you see this 3.5 years. This 3.5 year period, 1,260 days, and 42 months, and a time, times and a half a time. These are all apocalyptic symbolism created in the book of Daniel. And it does say in Daniel chapter 9 that this last week, the 70th week, the first half of it would be where all these things happen with the destruction of the temple and the abomination that causes desolation, which is the destruction of the temple. And so John and the vision that John is receiving is working on these same numbers that come from Daniel to describe this period from 30 to 70 AD. So it's not a literal 3.5 years, but it's 40 years that are symbolized by this 3.5. So the beast cannot stop the Messiah, and he can't attack the Christ, and so then he goes after the woman, who's Israel. and he delegates the power to Rome to do this. And so in this 3.5, which is not just a time of toil and persecution, but also a partial judgment, he's given a limited time to use Rome to destroy Israel and the temple, which destroys this old covenant or this messianic nation covenant. It's not just that he's angry and he's like, kicking the dog kind of a thing and just doing whatever he can. No, this is very targeted. He's going after God's plan, this scroll of the Lamb, and he is trying to disrupt it. And here, now that the Messiah is gone, now he is trying to disrupt the mother. And so he tries to destroy Israel, and that is part of God's plan. And so he is allowed to use Rome to do this. And he does. All right, well, I hope you had another good time being able to listen to my interpretation of Revelation today, Revelation 12 and 13, or the first half of 13. Next week, we'll talk about the second half of chapter 13 as well as chapter 14. The gets back to the 144,000, which we've already talked about. And so have a great evening. Remember to like and subscribe and share with your friends. That really helps the channel.